Hello, and welcome to Chapter 7 of The Sands Beneath the Moon, the ongoing story of a sorcerer and his travels alongside a merchant caravan. If you enjoy these videos, please give a like or comment with some of your feedback. My Substack is in the description, as well, if you would like access to the written version of my work. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the video. There were several reasons that the Witch Kings of Elentria rarely endeavored to conquer fiefs beyond their cursed homeland. Foremost among such causes, in regards to the prospect of invading their southern neighbor, was the sheer presence of the sun itself above the desert. For all the power of their dark sorcery, for all the monstrosities they could conjure and shape, their physical resilience was a meager thing, and the sun burned their exposed skin most severely over time. Kyrus was hardy and willful by Elentrian standards. He wore robes and a cloak that shielded his body well, and the wound in his side that he'd had when the caravan had first found him had mostly healed by now. Yet still the sorcerer found himself dragging behind the formidable northern warriors and the nameless woman who had spent most of her life in the open desert. With the merchants and slaves from Tythal, and their carts laden with cumbersome narcotics and supplies, the pace of travel had been more measured. But now it seemed that the endurance of the sorcerer was the limiting factor in their more purposeful pace. The men of Hakal were hardly more used to clambering over sand dunes than the Elentrian was, being from a land that was itself often draped in snow and ice. But their impressive resilience and vigor pushed them to match the tempo of the nomad who navigated the region with a well-practiced ease. One could argue that this feat was doubly impressive, as they traveled while clad in mail and carrying weapons, and one of them was guiding a relatively small ox by a lead of rope. The warriors marched in a loose formation under Scarson's command, close enough to move to cover each other immediately in the event of a sudden ambush, save for the youngest of the band, who had once again been given the undesirable task of guarding the sorcerer trailing the rest of the group by a generous number of yards. Kyrus had learned that the young man's name was Valif, that he was an impatient fellow, and that he was rather annoyed at having been saddled with bodyguard duty in the protection of a warlock, but otherwise found him to be less than talkative. Meanwhile, the nomad, acting as their guide, stood near the front of the formation alongside Scarson, eager to stay well within the range of protection of the nearby warriors, but also to stay as far away from the witchman as was pragmatically possible. This state of affairs was relatively consistent for the first several hours of the march, during which Janaba had shrunk to a distant speck on the horizon. It was past midday, beneath the heat of a furious sun, when Scarson first raised his hand and called his men to a halt. The warlock closed the distance between himself and the rest of the band and breathed a sigh of relief, assuming rest was now imminent. The weight of the sun's relentless attentions, and of the day's hurried pace, had hobbled Kyrus's usually sharp senses. Even in his diminished state, it did not take the sorcerer long to notice, as he leaned on his staff, took a greedy drink from his water skin, and caught his breath, that no one else was in a relaxed position. The warriors around him seemed very alert, their hands closed on the hilts of weapons as their guide had been shifted behind them and moved towards the center of their formation. Cursing in a dark and more or less forgotten language, most unpleasant and guttural in its acoustic qualities, the sorcerer willed his mind back into focus and hefted his staff again, a substantially more literal curse on the tip of his tongue, as he surveyed the sand-covered, seemingly empty landscape around them, before noticing that the keen eyes of the Northmen were focused on a single far-away dune, which to Kyrus's eyes appeared to be vacant of anything even remotely interesting. Still, he did not assume Scarson was the type to jump at shadows. "You saw something." It was not Kyrus who asked the question. The warlock would have considered that a rather pointless way to phrase such a query. But Velif appeared to be rather frustrated at having missed something important while lagging behind the bulk of the company with the aforementioned warlock. He wanted to be made aware of the situation that had captured his brother's attention immediately. Dark shape, larger than a man. Moved quickly. Couldn't get a good look at it. Scarson summarized the situation with a brevity characteristic of his people. The conclusion the leader of the company had come to, that their band had been noticed by their enemy, and was in significant danger as a result of that fact, was one that he left to be inferred, trusting that everyone present was savvy enough to come to that conclusion on their own. They'll come for us tonight, then. Try to close with that one, and I suspect it will flee. Any hours spent preparing for an attack by day will likely be wasted. Kyrus spoke after a moment spent staring at the towering sand dune he had just been told something was lurking behind. His tone was calm and certain, if mildly exhausted by the day's unrelenting pace. Clearing his throat and ridding his tone of weariness, Kyrus spoke with the academic clarity of a man who was intimately familiar with the habits and nature of the beasts that now stalked the group. The kind of creations of which he was once an artisan, until circumstance and his own choices had separated him from his most advanced tools and resources, and the obligation to use them in such distasteful ways. Dark beasts tend to operate best without the eye of the sun upon them. Indoors, or at night, or under the shrouded skies of my homeland, or where they prefer to strike, where they will be at their strongest and the sight of their prey is most compromised. I am familiar with the habits of such creatures. Tighten the formation and keep your eyes open. I don't want to be caught flat-footed if these witch spawn decide to act unpredictably. Scarson's reply was sharp and to the point. The precaution of a man who had glimpsed the unpredictable nature of a war many times over, a thing with which Kyrus was not entirely unacquainted, but which had defined nearly the entirety of the mercenary chieftain's existence. The men who fought with Scarson fell in line immediately. The guide and the warlock followed suit without much delay. As the nomad fell back in line near the head of their band, so as to guide their path, Kyrus, who remained in his position at the rear of the group, noticed her hand lingering near the folds of her cloth garments. She held the hand with a certain nervousness, despite an attempt to make its position seem natural. The sorcerer found a slight smirk creeping into his expression as he recognized the posture. A concealed blade was unlikely to avail her much if she came face to face with one of the beasts they were expecting to encounter, but he admired the prudent instinct that had led her to acquire one, and it was certainly a better armament than nothing. It was the desert dweller who seemed the most anxious after the revelation that they were already in the sights of a predator most unnatural. She fidgeted and seemed to hesitate slightly every few dozen steps. For most of the warriors, the only changes to their demeanor were that their hands gripped their weapons a bit more firmly, and the voices in which they conversed and bantered lowered, so as to better listen to their surroundings. Velif was the only one whom the sorcerer could discern any hint of rattled nerves from. The young warrior's posture had become rigid, and his complaints about their slow pace had ceased. He had not been tested as thoroughly as his compatriots, and while ready for the battle ahead, he was sensibly wary of the manner of foe that had laid low Vargas, the sort of enemy he himself had not faced before. Scarson, by contrast, held a relaxed posture, but kept adjusting his grip on the sword at his belt. The warlock and his men alike knew their leader well enough to discern that it was not a product of being unnerved. Though his face maintained its stoic demeanor, Kyrus soon realized that the lead warrior of Akal was unreservedly excited about the prospect of what was to come. The lurking figure was spotted several more times throughout the day, only ever briefly, and perched upon distant dunes. Yet the locations of its appearance seemed to grow just a bit closer, and the scent of magic was smelled faintly upon the wind, as the afternoon sun painted the desert sands in a darker form of light, with its orange and red hue. And Scarson called a halt to the group's advance in order to make camp. There was little rest to be had as the sun sank behind the horizon. Anticipation of a battle certain to come, and strange noises as the shadows lengthened beyond the light of the campfire, held every member of the band alert and on edge. As darkness became absolute, save for the light of a scant moon, Cyrus produced his dagger and several stones from the pocket of his robes. The sorcerer used his ritualistic blade to create a moderately deep yet careful incision on the pointer finger of his right hand and trace practiced symbols across the smooth stones, of the sort one would find on a river bank or near a lake. The others of the group eyed the warlock with great unease, and the hands of several moved deliberately towards their weapons. Even the woman from the desert, Cyrus noted with a hint of amusement, had her hand poised near where her dagger must be concealed. But the spell he was invoking was not particularly dark or baleful in nature. Once the symbols were engraved, Cyrus distributed the stones around the edges of the fire's light. Scarson was the first among the band to demand an explanation for the warlock's strange behavior in a tone that sounded equal parts agitated and mistrustful. "What unclean powers do you invoke now, witch?" No sooner had the mercenary spoken than the stones began to radiate a soft white glow, which was not uncomfortable to look upon, yet reached a fair distance with its clear light. Nothing grandiose. While we Elentrians see well in the dark, there are certain areas even we prefer to remain lit. Studies, libraries, places of relaxation or delicate labor that requires keenly detailed awareness. For that, as in most things, we turn to our magic. I thought it best that we not rely on the fire's light alone when they come tonight. Cyrus elaborated on his actions with a almost imperceptible smirk at the looks of superstitious dread which had been aimed at him the moment before. He returned to his position by the fire without saying another word. Normally, the warlock was the sort who preferred to have some distance between himself and his companions, but tonight he kept close to the armed warriors, as did their guide. This was a night where the concept of safety in numbers was an ever-present thought, as the acrid stench grew more potent upon the wind. Cyrus was the first to notice the creatures in the darkness moving soon after sundown. In the day his perceptions were second to the keen senses of the mercenaries, but in the dark they were second to none. There were a good number of them, perhaps as many as 8, which was quite an impressive amount of such beasts for a lone sorcerer in a desert tower. Most of the figures in the darkness were of varying shapes and sizes, but all appeared at a distance to be constructed of entirely solid matter. There were no shadow things among this menagerie of monsters. At the very least, with any luck, Theldasama had only been able to produce one of the semi-tangible masterpieces. "They're here. Their bodies have no uniform structure. I see 4 coming in from the front and the rest splitting off. They are moving fast." The sorcerer swiftly and dispassionately relayed what he was seeing to the warriors, with only a hint of nerve seeping into his tone. As the creatures approached with alarming speed that was to be expected of such inhuman beasts. By the time Cyrus was on his feet, with his staff held at the ready, the Northmen were already moving. Their weapons and shields were soon held at the ready. Scarson was bellowing orders in a tone that brooked no hesitation. Any other human force Cyrus had ever witnessed would have broken immediately. When a lion the size of 4 of its natural kin, with the head of an eel and teeth reminiscent of an ocean predator, lunged from the darkness with its maw gnashing for one of the men at the center of the defensive line which had formed. Its target drove his spear towards its neck of the beast, which snapped at the haft between the force of the warrior's attack and the scaly hide of the monstrous lion, that was only partially concealed by patches of fur which somehow managed to grow on its reptilian skin. The warrior hit the ground with a sickening crunch of bone under the monstrous weight of the beast, yet somehow managed to draw a dagger from his belt and plunge it into the unnatural mouth of the lion creature as it attempted to strike the final blow. The move cost the fallen warrior his arm, but the monster's head recoiled from the wound, and it was driven back further when the spear of another warrior pierced its eye with a precise and furious stab. When the lion recoiled, it was further struck by a bolt of crackling sorcery hurled by a dark incantation from Kyrus, which blasted away a good chunk of its seemingly impervious scaled hide and sent it reeling to the sand in agony. When the Northman whose spear had gouged its eye fell upon it with more ferocity than any beast, it did not rise again. Elsewhere, the skirmish was devolving into a series of duels between men and the blasphemous products of sorcery. Not even the prowess of these mercenaries of Akal could maintain a cohesive defensive line against a semi-coordinated assault by such physically overwhelming creatures. Valif and a senior warrior clashed with a creature reminiscent of a giant ape, which was perhaps 3 times the size of a man, and wore the head of a particularly wicked-looking baboon. The creature was clad in some form of scaled armor, and wielded a curved sword that was not unlike a sort of meat cleaver. The use of tools suggested that its intellect far surpassed that of its more beastly kin. Valif was physically gifted, both fast and strong even by the standards of Akal, and in coordination with the more experienced warrior, he managed to deal several light wounds to the creature with his sword. But his shield had been partially destroyed, and his left arm wounded by a single brutish swing of the creature's curved blade, something he had made the mistake of attempting to block. On the other side of the front, 3 mercenaries battled a huge scorpion as tall and broad as a rhinoceros, with a serpent whose fangs dripped venom for a tail. It had snatched up one of the men in its pincers and bisected him, but the second warrior had not wasted the opportunity to deal a thunderous blow with a 2-handed axe that shattered a portion of the arachnid's carapace. The combatant wielding the large axe had fallen back just in time to avoid a snapping pincer, and the third warrior had dealt another substantial injury by weaving out of the way of its deadly serpentine tail and driving his spear in between the cracks of its carapace, created by his companion. Other isolated contingents of 1 or 2 Northmen fought with smaller, if still formidable creatures, many resembling men or serpents, though greatly misshapen in some way, with elongated, scaly clawed appendages. Skarsen was engaged with one of the dark beasts alone. It was a ghastly merging of serpent and man that towered 2 feet above even the formidably sized chieftain, without counting the tail slithering behind it. It had 4 arms, each ending in scaled human-like hands, each wielding a saber of much finer quality than the cleaver the ape thing had held. It struck with speed, precision, and skill, not merely brute strength, and its eyes blazed with a fearsome, if malevolent, intellect. It might have been a refinement of the method used to produce a beast which had attacked the nomadic woman in the desert, or perhaps just a better quality specimen. When it had maneuvered around the engaged warriors and reached their leader, its eyes had shone with a sadistic anticipation of victory. Now that anticipation had turned into frustration as its intended victim fought like a whirlwind of steel, his sword and shield keeping pace with the man-serpent's 4 blades. The reptile was fast, strong, and relentless, but just when it looked as though the northern warrior was doomed to be overwhelmed, Skarsen drove his shield into the creature's fanged maw, backing it off and bloodying its mouth as he seized the initiative. As the fighting grew more intense and scattered, the guide of the warband had drawn her hidden dagger in mildly trembling hands while attempting to make herself look as small as possible by the fire, a wise strategy by most accounts, which had so far proven effective. So effective, in fact, that the small, malformed, imp-like creature moving along the ground and creeping closer to Skarson's back, had failed to notice her entirely. Normally, the leader of the Northmen would have heard the movements even of this creature designed by foul magic for stealth, but his mind was fully engaged with the lethal beast before him, and his men all seemed immersed in their own terrible struggles. He had not noticed when the man-serpent had hissed a command, and the imp had crawled from the shadows at a skulking pace. But the nomad had noticed, and after calling out a stammering warning that was lost amid the sounds of battle, she lunged at its back with her blade inexpertly stabbing. Her sudden burst of courage was a symptom of desperation. She knew that a terrible fate would await her if this battle was lost. To the nomad's credit, she managed to gore the imp multiple times and make it yelp in a tone most repulsive to the human ears before it was able to turn and get to grips with her. Though half the size of a human man, cowardly, and the least of the monsters the company was engaged in battle with, the imp, regardless, possessed claws and a strength that defied its small size. After a frenetic and vicious but clumsy engagement, the nomad was thrown to the ground with lacerations on her face and arms that were deep, though not lethal. The imp, seeking to rectify the non-lethality of the damage done, pounced on the woman and knocked the dagger from her hand. Before the diminutive beast could land a fatal bite to her throat with its needle-like teeth, the nomad raised her right arm and took the bite to it instead. The desert woman screamed out from the gigantic pain radiating from the limb, but she remained alive. A moment later, a gangly hand settled upon the imp's shoulder, and a word was spoken that made the woman's ears ring with yet more pain. The effect on the small beast, however, was far less gentle, as it seemed to unravel into dust which blew away into the desert wind, leaving the gaunt form of the Elentrian warlock standing over her. While the altercation had occurred between the imp and the nomad, the battle was turning elsewhere. Skarson managed to bait the man-serpent to do a powerful strike that left two of its blades embedded in his shield. With the twist of the shield, both it and two of the monster's 4 elegant scimitars were thrown down into the sand. Another furious and lightning-fast exchange of blows ensued, in which a third sword was sent flying from the man-serpent's scaly hand. A moment later, the dagger from Skarson's belt slashed open the creature's belly, and his sword pierced its throat. Across the battlefield, the ape too fell, as the warrior who had dealt the final blow on the monstrous lion drove his spear through the back of the ape thing, facing down Velif, who had been left standing against it alone after it had cleaved his more experienced companion from head to sternum with its crude weapon. The massive scorpion was finally brought low when the combatant it was fighting with a spear managed to get behind it and pin its serpentine tail to the ground with the spear, before the one with an axe delivered the final blow to its face with a roar that echoed across the dunes. The lesser creatures found themselves outnumbered and butchered, or were slain by horrifically effective spells cast by Kyrus. Skarson wiped clean his blades with an old piece of cloth, then sheathed his dagger, but not his sword, in the case of one of the monsters not being quite as dead as it looked. Then he went about the unenviable task of determining who was dead and who was not, along with which of the wounded would live and which would not. The bulk of Thel-Lasama's most lethal creations had been put down. The scent of their spilled blood and bodies now polluted the air with a far fouler smell than they had possessed while alive, but not without a price paid in blood. All the survivors needed to do now was ensure the beast's architect would join his creations the following day.